Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so this is going to be a pretty short video. Today what we're just going to be focusing on are some of my tips for studying for the AP exam. So I'm going to try and keep it nice and simple and nice and short. These are some of the big things that I think will improve the way that you study. I know that a lot of you guys put a lot of time into studying for exams and studying for different things throughout the year, but hopefully this just gives you a little bit of a better insight on how to do this properly and how to get the most out of your time that you're spending studying. So first thing that you want to understand, there's difference between what I would call passive studying and active studying. And what I've noticed is most students that study incorrectly do passive forms of studying. And a passive form of studying is where you don't actively have to do anything. Kind of all the information is coming to you, and you're not really engaging with the material or engaging with your studying at all. Active studying makes you do something with the material, and it kind of activates your thinking, and that's why it's much more effective. So I actually want to start with just some examples of passive studying, because a lot of you may be doing some of these things, and I'm going to try to explain why they're not the best forms of studying. So some passive studying techniques that I think are pretty common amongst students, and we don't want to be doing these alone. You can do them in conjunction with more active studying techniques, but you don't want to be doing them solely on their own because they're not very effective. First big one, I think, I mentioned this today in class, is reading over your notes. I think a lot of students do this. You look back at all those notes you've taken from the textbook or from class and you read them over, but you're not actually doing anything with the material again. All you're doing is reading it. It's very passive. And so we can use this as a first step to try to improve and just refresh our memory a little bit, but it doesn't actually make the information sink into your head the way that you would hope it would when you study. Reading a review book or rereading the textbook, same kind of thing. It's proven, scientific studies have proven that you only retain about 10 to 15% of what you read. You lose the other 85%. And so you have to actually demonstrate your knowledge somehow in order to see what you do and you don't remember and what you do and you don't know. Last one that I think is pretty common probably now in modern times is watching just review videos on YouTube and or AP Classroom. Again, these can help refresh your memory a little bit, but they don't really go as far as you need to really prepare. So what I would say about these passive studying techniques, they're a good thing to do in conjunction with the active studying techniques that I'm going to give you. So I'm going to try to give you some better ways to study, and hopefully you're going to take some of this advice and use it when you study for the AP exam. So here are some more recommended ways to study. So my first one is to use AP review videos. So I made a bunch of videos by time period. There's a lot of other history teachers and just YouTubers in general who've made some really good history videos. Specific ones for AP US history are out there, like Heimler's History and some other review videos that are excellent. But what I would do in conjunction with it, I would not just watch the videos. I would do potentially a couple of things. I might watch the videos and take notes while I watch the video. Or watch the video and then complete practice multiple choice questions that I made available to you on AP Classroom, because what that's doing is it's forcing you to see what you did and you didn't retain from watching the video. It's showing your weak areas and topics that you don't understand that well, because you know if you get some multiple choice questions wrong, you might have to restudy those or go over those particular topics. So once you add that more active piece, whether it's note taking or it's doing practice multiple choice or a practice essay question or something like that with it, it's going to make it sink in much, much better than if you just watch the video alone. Second one, there's tons of sample essay questions out there. If you go on the actual AP website, they've released the old essay questions. So I think they have all the old essay questions from all the way back to 2015, 2016. You can look at those old essay questions. They're a great way to see what you do and you don't know, because students in years past, last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they sat and took that exam and they were in your same shoes that you're going to be in a couple of weeks. I would try to outline those different essays and try to bullet point things that I would talk about and include, and try and be as detailed as you can. What factual information would you want to include in these essays if you were actually writing them? How might you organize your paragraphs? What facts would you put in each paragraph? Even you can do even a sample thesis statement if you wanted to. There's a lot of different things that you could do, but if you really brainstorm it and kind of flesh it out, it could be really helpful. Third thing that I would do, or potentially I think is very valuable, is something called mind mapping for the different time periods. So in our class, you really want to know the time periods well, and not necessarily like specific dates throughout the time periods, but to know the actual time periods themselves can be extremely helpful, and really can kind of give you a lot of additional knowledge, because really what you need to know is to have a good understanding of the beginning and the end of the time period, and to kind of know the major key events that take place. So I'm going to go into more detail with this as we go a little bit more into the screencast. Last thing you could do is something I would call Persia brainstorming, which is another format of brainstorming for like different time periods. So I'm going to go into detail with these and kind of explain them. You could ignore that all these say number 1. It should have been 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not really sure why it came out like that, but you can kind of ignore that aspect of it. But these are 4 different techniques. So I want to go into detail with the last 3 and just explain them a little bit and give you examples so that you know exactly what I'm talking about. So the first one I'm going to go through is mind mapping. So I'm going to give you an example. So what you would do is you would kind of take like right in kind of like the beginning, or excuse me, in the middle of the page, you would take a time period. So I chose time period 2 as an example, which is the British colonial America time period from 1607, so the founding of Jamestown, to 1754, which is the beginning of the French and Indian War. You put that right in the middle of your paper. And then what you're trying to do is kind of brainstorm, like what pops into your mind first when you think of this time period. Now, how I would do this, I would try to do this for each time period, before I watch a review video, before I do any multiple choice, before I do anything else. I would try to see like, what do I know? Like, do I know anything about this? So like if I was doing this, something that might pop into my head first is one of the major colonies that develops at the time, which is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So that might be like the first thing that I might think of, right? You might think of something else. Now, what you're looking for next is like, okay, now you thought of Massachusetts Bay. What do you know about Massachusetts Bay? What comes to your mind, right? So to me, first thing that pops into my mind is the Puritans, right? Because I know the Puritans are the dominant religion in Massachusetts Bay. It makes me think of them. Then you might kind of try to branch off, like what characteristics do I know about the Puritans? What do I think about when I think about the Puritans, right? So maybe a lot of things, you're going to try and branch off into a lot of different directions with the Puritans, right? And you might think of things like John Winthrop and his City Upon a Hill, or their value of education and the foundation of universities like Harvard and Yale, and the fact that they had a high literacy rate, or the fact that they, put out this idea of American exceptionalism, or even this idea of how intolerant they were as a group of people. Now you could keep going with this, right? You could branch off from these smaller ones. Like, what does that make you think of, each of these different smaller things? So I'm just going to give you an example with religious intolerance. Like, this makes me think of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, the major religious dissenters in Puritan New England and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And you could keep going. You could go as much detail as you want. And then the next thing that I would do is try and branch it off in a different direction, right? After you feel like you've exhausted your knowledge of this, go somewhere else. So maybe you think about the Chesapeake Bay Colony, or maybe you think about Pennsylvania and the Quakers and William Penn. There's a lot of different directions you can go. Or maybe you think of the Second Great Awakening, right? And you try and branch off, the First Great Awakening, but you try and branch off into different areas and like see what comes to your mind. Now, the key thing here is you want to do this without looking at your notes. You are not watching videos while you're doing this. You're not looking at your notes. It is just you trying to brainstorm what you remember. Then you go watch a video, then you go look at the textbook, and you try to fill in the gaps. What didn't I remember? What things do I need to kind of highlight? And you could even highlight the things that were like new knowledge that you forgot, or things that you think you have to study more. This is a great way to kind of start taking a look at different time periods. An alternative way to do it, if you don't like that, you could use what I would call Persia brainstorming. Persia is just an acronym in this case. I usually don't use the last 2 letters. I usually just use the first 4. So P stands for political, E stands for economic, R stands for religious, and S stands for social. I stands for intellectual, and A stands for artistic. We do some intellectual discussion in our class. We rarely talk about artistic developments in our class. That's why I kind of leave it off. But you can put them in, you can include them if you want to as well. This is just another way of brainstorming. So maybe you think more in chart form and you don't like the mind mapping one. I tend to like the mind mapping one because it's kind of organic and you could kind of just like see how things relate to each other. But if you think like more political economic, you do the same thing in the time periods. Like what is happening politically in this time period? You try and bullet point key characteristics as factual and as in-depth as you can. What do you think of when you think of economic in the time period? And the same thing, you try to think, as factual and as in-depth as you can. And you try and go into as much detail as you can throughout your brainstorming period. And that can really help to activate it. Same things apply though. You are not looking at your notes while you're doing it. You're not watching a video while you're doing it. You're doing this before you do that. And then you go back and you might add things to the chart. Last thing you could do is you could kind of take a look at sample essay prompts. So this is just an example. Evaluate the relative importance of the causes of the rise of industrial capitalism in the U.S. in the period 1865 to 1900. Same thing as I mentioned earlier. You take the prompt. These are great because these are the actual questions that were on previous AP exams. I made a ton of them available to you guys on AP Classroom, and they go by time period. So you could kind of look by time period. And it basically, you can outline and say, okay, if this was my question, what are they really asking here? How would I set my paragraphs up? But not just how would you set them up, what factual, concrete information would you want to include if you were actually writing this, right? Like this one, for example, like relative importance of the causes. Remember, that's a type of question. You want to refamiliarize yourself with types of questions because that's kind of asking you which causes were more important than other causes, right? It's going beyond just telling me there's a bunch of different causes. It's kind of more argument driven. So I think that this can help you too because it gives you the complexity of the questions that they're going to ask you about the material. These I might do after I've watched videos and after I have read something over because they're a little bit more complex. They're more analytical. You really have to think about some of these things in order to be able to come up with some of these answers, and you're utilizing the information. So I might do this after I did mind mapping and like maybe watch some videos or did stuff like that. And then you could kind of tackle some of these questions because it's a more analytical thing, a more analytical way to kind of study, which is what you're going to have to do on the actual exam. Okay, so I think that kind of takes us through like the different ways of studying. So hopefully you guys find that to be pretty helpful. I'm going to try and incentivize your studying through some extra credit. So I'm going to post that, along with this in a different assignment. But hopefully you guys kind of take advantage of the fact that you have a ton of material available to you. And hopefully this helps you to do some better, more specific and focused studying.